Good morning. I'm Catherine Baird. I am the CEO of Ethics Game and am really pleased to be with you today to talk about the Ethical Lens Inventory and a little bit about the history of ethics and how you can become a moral influencer. I'm going to now move and we're going to share our screens and move into our presentation. As we begin to think about ethics, the question that we have is what difference does it make that we are engaging in the conversation? What is true is that your ethics, how you behave and treat yourself and treat other people, depends on what you believe. And so, as we change our minds, we find that we can also change lives. And so, I'd like to talk with you today about a path towards ethical maturity as we begin to shape values and learn how you can be a more effective person within your community. The question on the table is always, can this in fact make a difference? Each of us are involved in a developmental pathway, growing ever more ethical as we get more experiences, as we think about how we have impacted others, and as our scope of responsibilities shift, we begin to think differently about ethics. So the conversation you've had in your classes at MSU over the past semester are just the next step on your own growth to being an ethically mature person. What we look for is our ethical identity. How do we choose to behave and to show up consistently in the various places of our lives? In this process, what we do is we choose behaviors that count for being good and ethical in our community and for ourselves. And this process is an ongoing discernment process of what counts in this community, what behaviors are expected in that community, what behaviors do I expect of myself. So let me talk with you a little bit about how that journey, that developmental pathway unfolds. Your ethics, the actions you take in community, in how you treat yourself and others, is the way that you translate your core values, the things that are the most important to you, into action. Our values are ideals that give significance to our lives. If you think about what's really important to you, what gives your life meaning and purpose, these are grounded in our values. They then become reflected in the priorities we choose. Do we choose this activity over another? Do I choose to hang out with my friends, or do I choose to go to a social event with other folks? Do I choose to study, or do I choose to go and to be with other people? How do we choose the priorities and how do we live our lives? We act on these beliefs and behaviors consistently and repeatedly. One of the things that is very useful is the fact that many of our ethical behaviors are habitual. So, for example, I have a friend who is working on gratitude. And so she very intentionally is choosing to interact with every event, with every person from an attitude of gratitude. And over the course of the year she's been working on it, we can see more consistent behaviors as she lives into this value that she's focusing on very intentionally. To get there, we have to know ourselves. We have two pieces of the conversation. One is, what are our core values and commitments? The other is, what is your shadow side and where can you be tempted? My friend noticed that she was being very grumpy a lot of the times and was being very critical of other people. As she took a look at her core value, which was how can I engage with others from a place of respect and love, she realized that her negative attitude was impacting that value. And so she began to work on how can I interact with the world from a place of gratitude and noticing where it was she turned up in her life as being not grateful. And that began to change her behaviors as she began to pay attention to how she was being in the world. As we move into this conversation together, we have some foundational definitions. First of all, each of us in this conversation has a compass of personal values and motives. Those are very important to us as we begin to think about them over our lives. The next thing we have are ethics, actions that count for meeting shared community values. These are always in conversation. I bring my values to a meeting, to a classroom, to a a business a business situation, and that classroom, that business, those other people bring their values in, and we talk about how we are going to be together. We then have professional ethics, our shared and enforced professional norms. Many of you are going to be accountants. Many of you are going into human relations. Many are going into marketing. Many are going to be doing management. Each of those areas within a business discipline has professional norms, and that become and inform how we begin together. So, a little bit about me. When I was your age, I asked the question, if everybody is so certain about what is right and what is wrong, why do we have so many different answers to the foundational questions of how should we be together? And the answer came up over many years of study. It depends. The context in which we are doing our work absolutely determines which of a multitude of behaviors that are acceptable is the best behavior in this situation. Now, to understand this, I'd like you to go back about 600 years in your imagination to what we call the Age of Belief. Before the Age of Enlightenment, people believed that all truth was divinely revealed. They lived in communities where people were believed the same thing. Often they were religiously in the same community, so they had the same scriptures or understandings of how they should become. And ordinary human beings like you and me did not question much how they should behave. We just lived into what the community said was best. With the age of reason, the notion became that individuals had a responsibility for determining for themselves how best they should live. And the expectation was that through reason and science, we could figure out what was true, what was the best way to live. And so, for the past 300 or 400 years, the project for people studying ethics has been to figure out what are the universal principles by which all people should live. And that was the expectation when I was your age in college. But over the past 70 years, actually a little bit longer than when I was in college, we have understood that those universal principles don't really exist. We have some ideas towards them, but those principles cannot tell us in a specific situation how we should behave. We also have learned that you and I have something called a moral identity, something that defines how we are going to be with others. That moral identity is shaped by three things. First of all, we now know that some of our ethical tendencies are inherited. Children come into this world with what we call pro-social behaviors. They want to be with others. They bond with their mother, their father, their siblings, and they have varying levels of cooperative behavior. We then know that as that child comes into the family, whatever that family looks like, that family and then the larger communities as that child grows up shape expectations for behavior. My mother used to say, Catherine, if you're going to be a member of this family, you need to make sure you clean your plate. If you're going to be a member of this family, you have to make your bed. You have to keep your agreements. You cannot bully your sisters. And so my parents began to shape my understanding of what was important in our communities. And this is an important task for each of you to determine and to pay attention to what messages you got about how to be a good person in communities. And that's where our psychology comes into play. Each of us has interpreted the messages of our childhood, the leanings of our biology differently. And along the way, we continually adjust to how we need to be in community and what we need to do. And we have understandings of ourselves. We have an understanding of what counts for us for being a good person. And then we get feedback from the community about the degree to which they agree or disagree with our understandings. Well, as this knowledge came forward in the study of ethics, people got really nervous. They were afraid that without universal principles that led to universal behaviors, we would have a system where no moral system was better than any other, and we would not have civilization. What we're here to tell you is that there is no system that will tell you what is true in every situation. There is no system that will tell you what is good in every situation. What we need to use is our reason and our community together to discern those places. What that is called then is an ethics of ambiguity. Any given situation is going to be ambiguous, and we have to decide ourselves in this moment, what are we going to do? Well, as this became clear to me, the question I asked was, is there an overarching conversation that will help me make sense out of this ethics of ambiguity? And it turns out there is. After reading more philosophy and more ethics than any one human being should read, I discovered that every ethics conversation has two elements to it. The first element is the relationship of the individual to the group. When does the individual get to say, this is what I believe, this is what I think is important, and this is how I'm going to behave? And when does the group get to say, if you're going to be part of our group, these are the behaviors that we have for you, and this is what we expect? Now, you and I, over the past 3 to 5 years, have lived through a major experiment with this called COVID. As you remember, we had conversations about, do you go out? Do you go to the stores? Do you wear a mask? How does that play out? And there were many people who said, I don't choose to be vaccinated. And there were many communities that said, if you are not vaccinated, you cannot hang out with us. And then we had professionals in healthcare and in business who had to navigate that tension, that ethical tension between those two viewpoints. The other one is head and heart. When do we follow the processes? When do we follow the procedures? When do we follow the science, as it were? And when do we follow our own experience, our own understanding of ourselves, the particularities of this context? And that, again, is an ongoing conversation. As we put processes in place, human resource people do this all the time. How do we hire? How do we decide what balance we're going to give to diversity and equity and inclusion? How do we decide how we're going to live into community expectations for the environment and for our social obligations and for governance, those things that you've been studying in your business classes? The head gives us some ideas of the expectation, and the heart says, given I'm a little tiny business, do I really have to do this? Given I'm a really big business, can I use my political clout in order to make and change the rules? Given I'm dealing with this particular person who's having a really rough time, what do I do? And so again, our head and our heart are in conversation about how we should be together. Well, what I discovered is that each of the ethical theories that become part of what we study look at those privileges or those processes differently. And those led to the 4 ethical lenses that you studied as part of the ethical lens inventory and that you explored when you did Merger Madness. People who live in the responsibilities lens believe that individuals should use their head to determine the principles that are the best. And they have values such as freedom and accountability and being transparent. People in the results lens say, no, you begin with individuals following their heart to determine what they care about, what they desire. We care about making sure that values such as free will and good results and flexibility are the most important. On the community side, people in the relationship lens who are part of the justice theories say, members of the community need to use their heads in order to come up with processes that are fair, that are just, that show that we care for all people. And then the reputation lens, people say, no, members of the community need to use their heart to figure out how to be compassionate, how to be courageous, and how to set a good example. Each of us have one of these lenses that resonates most with our ethical identity, and this is where we begin. And that was the gift of the ethical lens inventory, to begin giving you a bit of window, a bit of thoughtfulness about your own ethical identity. So let's take a little deeper dive into each of them. Consequentialism, the results lens, says the most important thing that we do is follow our experience. Martha Nussbaum talks about how we follow our heart's desires and we choose goals to give our life meaning. And Martha talks about, Dr. Nussbaum talks about how people will cooperate to create the greatest good. She also talks about how we have to equip each other to be able to make these decisions. And so the conversations you have in your classroom about what makes a good marketer, what makes a good human resource professional, what makes a good finance professional, help us understand what goals we want to pursue. Do I want to do finance or do I want to do HR? As well as what kind of a person do I want to be as I live into my life meaning? As we move to the deontology, the um, the next lens, we have Immanuel Kant. And in this particular lens, the responsibilities lens, the question is, how do I use my reason to determine the principles that are the most important to me? Now, Kant believed that all reasonable people would identify the same principles and adopt the same duties. And we have some evidence of that because we have duties like tell the truth, be kind, do no harm, maintain confidentiality. Now, what this lens does not tell us is how to prioritize those conflicting duties, how to know which duties go particularly with which professions. And then these are very individual. What duties, what principles are important to people, not necessarily the community. Moving to the community side, we move into the relationship lens, the social contract. This is the side that said we are going to figure out how we are going to live together. And as we live together, we have two or three things we have to decide. The first, how are we going to distribute goods? Who gets what amount of money? Who gets what amount of food? Who gets what amount of healthcare? Who gets what amount of education? Who gets roads built? How do we treat individuals' personal property? Those are the kinds of questions the community comes together to decide. Now, we know that those are decided at a legislative level. So our federal Congress, individual state legislatures, communities decided. But it is also decided at an organizational level. What is our salary structure going to be? How are we going to look at bonuses? What are we going to do with vacation time, with sick time? Currently, the major conversation is, are we going to require people to come in person or are we going to allow remote work? All of those determine how goods are going to be distributed. Power is how you use the authority that you have. And core to this particular lens is people using their authority wisely so that they do not impose their will unjustly on other people. Kwame Appiah talks about the fact that you and I choose the communities that we are going to use as our standard. As companies joined the Business Roundtable, they committed to moving ahead the notion of a relationship among all stakeholders, not just primacy or giving priority to the shareholders. People in the Business Roundtable, those 150 or so CEOs who signed on to it, said our companies, our industries are committed to moving ahead values of the environment and caring for the environment. Social goods such as being fair and including all people in our work, and good governance with transparency and good financial management. And they are holding each other accountable for living into those values. And then finally, the reputation lens said, what kind of qualities do we expect of people in the various roles they live into? And so as you move into your profession, you will have people who say, as a member of this company, these are the kinds of values or virtues we expect you to do. As a member of this professional group, these are the kinds of values we expect you to have. And this professional group, these folks can help us move from the abstract values into the specific behaviors as they become our moral exemplars and help us understand how to grow in our profession. I spent the first 10 years of my life after grad school as a lawyer. I practiced law. I worked really diligently with underrepresented kids. I worked with abused parents, abused children. And as I did that, I became a fierce advocate for people and became very competent in going into court and stirring things up. As I moved into teaching, I went into my first professional conference with the same attitude and gave the visiting professor basically a really diligent cross-examination. And my dean took me aside and said, Catherine, if you want to be a member of this community, what you have to do is be kind. You do not cross-examine visiting professors. And so I changed my behaviors and I changed the way I interacted in order to become a good colleague in a professional setting called academics, as opposed to a good trial attorney in a legal system. And that's how we each begin to modify our behaviors and beliefs as we take on different roles. A case study for this recently has been Ernst& Young. As you probably have studied, Ernst& Young had a major find as it discovered that its accountants were cheating on the ethics exam. Now, I understand that you're saying, why would people do this? And that's one of the questions that we always ask when we look at people who we think know better, who participate in organizational wrongdoing. People who said in the responsibilities lens, principle that is the most important to me is honesty. And this is foundational for me as a human being, including my work as an accountant, would have used their individual sense of ethics to say, no, I am not going to cheat, even if everybody else is. People from the result lens said, if I'm going to respect myself, I need to cultivate habits of honesty. And cheating on an ethics exam is not going to get me there. And so I choose not to cheat. On the community side, the leadership of Ernst Young could have said, we want to make sure our processes are free from cheating in order to preserve the integrity of the profession. And therefore, if we see cheating, we're going to call it out and we're going to make sure it doesn't permeate through the organization. And the community said, given we rely on accountants, we trust those who have a reputation for honesty, and we value that. And the community thread, of course, was the one that was pulled in order to disclose that throughout the accounting firm, the other values were not upheld. But what we notice is that each one of these lenses had a slightly different reason to get to the same result. We expect our accountants to be honest and to take the ethics exam and not cheat. The thing that saves us as a community is often we get to the same result from the different reasons. What this means, as we think about Ernst Young, is that small acts of moral courage or cowardice shape the direction of our lives. Each of those individual accountants could have chosen to not cheat. The leadership could have chosen to enforce the norm of honesty. Every person, by the decision they made, changed ever so slightly the trajectory of the history of that organization. If there is one thing I would like you to take from this conversation today, it is that you and your choices make a difference. The greatest gift we have as human beings is the gift of free will. We get to choose what we're going to do, how we're going to respond, what we're going to believe, and how we're going to work and navigate with others in this community. And as we exercise that in things as tiny as picking up a piece of trash in the commons, we shape and move what is going on in our world as a whole. So let's now take a little bit deeper dive into the ethics of ambiguity. As you think about exercising what we call ethical agency, the ability to make choices about how you're going to believe and behave, what do you do? How do you get wisdom and understanding about how best to navigate this ambiguity? The first place we begin is ethical awareness. Know yourself. Every day we have an opportunity to say, what do I believe? Our beliefs actually inform how we behave. If I believe that all human beings are created equal, then I'm going to ask, how do I behave in a way to live into that belief? If I believe that some people in my neighborhood are dangerous, I will find myself behaving in a way that will protect me against the danger that I believe. And so, core to our ethics is to understand what we believe about ourselves and others, and to be willing to be educated and expand our understanding and look at the world differently. What are the habits and the reactions that drive you? Just like my friend was looking at patterns of gratitude, I noticed some years back that I reacted from everything out of defensiveness and anger. And that was not how I wanted to be as a human being. And so I began to notice, when did I become defensive? When did I become angry? Was there a different way of responding that was not defensive and angry? And change slowly those habits of reaction so that was not my first way of being with the world. And then we act from the best we know at the time. Now, over the course of my life, that includes a lot of apologies because I notice that I'm angry and then I apologize and change my behaviors. But all I can do is do the best that I know at the time. And this is where compassion and understanding helps us work with each other. If we assume that every person we interact with is acting from the best they know at the time, just like we are, we can walk with this world with a sense of gentleness as we begin to work together. Simone de Beauvoir began to help us understand this ethics of identity. She said, first of all, we have no certainty. We have no idea how other people are going to respond to us. And so I can do something that I believe is the kindest, gentlest, most important way of speaking my own truth and living out of my own sense of self. And someone else can be very offended by that. And I have to decide, am I going to change? Am I going to look at the world differently? Or am I going to say, this is just who I am and how I interact, and that's how it's going to be. De Beauvoir reminds us the way we know we're human is choosing to act. And I would ask at a postscript to this, not acting is as much of an action as acting. Remaining silent, those accountants who knew the cheating was going on and didn't say anything, was as much of an act as those who chose to cheat. The leadership who noticed the pattern of cheating, who chose not to stop it, acted as much as those who actively participated in the scandal. What we do, though, is as we get responses, we adjust our beliefs and behaviors. One of the gifts of what we call postmodern ethics is that there is no one truth, no one belief. There's this ongoing adjustment that we make in life. Is this this clearest understanding of truth that I have? Is this the best way to behave in order to bring forward the good? And we adjust ourselves. So what do? We work with what management theorists have talked about as our 4 core human needs. If we start down with the results lens, each of us has, as a human being, has to get material and social resources. The goals we choose help us get there. I was talking to a father whose daughter majored in music. Majored in musical theater. And the question he asked her is, if you pursue this, will you have a lifestyle that you want? Will you be able to support yourself? Will you be able to get the resources you need? Many of us have hobbies that we adore that could not possibly support us. And so we choose a profession, we choose a pathway to make sure we get the material and social resources we need. We have to keep searching for the truth. We do not, any of us, know all there is to know. And as we begin working for and continuing that journey, we will get to where we need to go. Our communities need to be safe. And so we put processes in place for safety, and all of us need to belong. The ethical lens inventory helps us understand our first approach to those core human needs. As I do this presentation live with people, one of the questions they find challenging is trying to maintain a sense of consistency as they adjust to the ambiguities of the context. And so we find that we might respond slightly differently to different situations, which is why very few people end up on the very edges of the ethical lens inventory grid. We all moderate our behavior somewhat to either live into community or to express our individuality within that community. We have 57 different explanations. And one of the questions I would invite you is to go back to that listing, that first chart that talks about your behaviors and talks about who you are, and see, is it accurate? What surprised you? Generally, what comes up is that people are very surprised about their ethical blind spots because they haven't thought about them very much. And this is a place that you can begin to explore in order to grow in ethical maturity. Those of you who landed on the far edge have very strong commitments, and people on the edges have a real difficult time working with people who think differently than they do. People in the middle can see all sides of a question, and they often have difficulties making decisions because they can be whipsawed both directions. People on a line are balanced, and they use the weaknesses and strengths of both of them. There is no right place to land on this grid. Every dot on this grid represents someone who is ethical, who has the capacity to make good and true ethical decisions. What it talks about is our preference and our sense of our ethical identity, and noticing that others have different preferences and different senses. So as we begin to move into the next phase after ethical awareness, into ethical agility, we begin by celebrating the differences. Notice how this variety is very useful as we begin to get a balanced and complete understanding of how to be in community together. We learn to listen carefully. What do others know? What are their experiences? What are their values? How does that inform and shape how they show up in our world together? And then notice that we are connected. We are interdependent. I can learn from my colleague who is studying gratitude, just as she can learn from me as I am studying anger. And we can notice that there are times when being strident is useful and times when a hot minute of anger can get us what we need and want and what is best. And then other times it's not so useful. But we do need to figure out how to work together. So as we do this, we turn to another philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead. He said, all of us together determine reality. And what that means is we determine both by our actions what happens, literally, how do we choose to behave? We determine the meaning that we give to that action. How do we begin to think about who we are as a group and who we are as individuals? And so our behaviors and our beliefs together shape what we know to be true and inform the future. Whitehead's contribution to ethics was that the future is not determined until you and I choose to act. And it's with each of those individual acts. Somebody at Ernst & Young could have said, you know, people, this is not who we are. This is not what the AICPA stands for. This is not what accountants do. And we are not going to be doing this. Let us take a look and step back and really see how we're going to be together. Every decision you and I make changes the world ever so slightly. I was in a meeting yesterday on a committee that I'm on with a friend who said, you know, I am just grumpy today. And her acknowledgement of being grumpy for no particular reason changed ever so slightly the direction of our conversation. I knew that I needed to be more gentle, move a little bit slower, be kind as she worked through her grumpiness. And she was really pretty clear she did not want to let her grumpiness get in the way of accomplishing what we were there to accomplish. And so, with that acknowledgement in my response to her grumpiness, the world changed a little tiny bit. All of those little tiny actions cumulatively come together to what we call history. My value is connected to values of the others in the whole. I am hoping that this conversation we're having, a one-sided conversation, is useful to you, that it's meaningful, that it helps you. The feedback I get when we do our questions, where people say, wow, that was really useful, gives me a sense that I'm making a difference in this world. Your value as a student, as a parent, as a child, as in whatever different roles you might have, get value out of how others respond to you. And so again, we pay attention. So how does this then play together? We notice that as we are ethically interdependent, we can rely upon others to give us some insight into their ethical perspectives. But at the end of the day, we all have to use all four. We all are individuals that make choices that contribute to our own happiness and thriving. We all use our reason to determine the principles by which we are supposed to live. We all are members of various communities that together design and implement processes, and we all are members of communities that let us know what character traits represent virtuous living. And as we share and understand together, both through conversation and actual behaviors, we are able to then create communities where people can thrive and the organizations are strong and sound. Well, we've been doing the ethical lens inventory for about 15 years now, and we've had, this slide says 500,000. We're now getting closer to 600,000 folks, and this is about how people lay out. And so as we see the differences in the lenses, we realize that as you and I go into our communities, we're going to have people from all the different ethical perspectives. The one point that I'd like to make in this is the difference between the reputation and the responsibilities lens. When we look at just gender, women tend to be in the responsibilities lens more than men. And I believe this is because of the way we are socialized into community. And so we begin, and we have not noticed that there's any difference in racial makeup. There's no difference in location in the United States. The other one research that we're just starting to see is people who are in China who do the ethical lens inventory versus the United States. And we're seeing that they go over to the relationship lens and have much more of a community sense than those of us in the United States who tend to be in the responsibilities lens. This is a scatter plot from one of your classes, and it is 145 of you out of the several hundred who took the ethical lens inventory, but really maps the way MSU students always map. You'll notice you have a higher concentration in the responsibilities lens, and so there's that tilt up towards that lens. And that is very common in all of our business schools. And so we find that business majors take on very seriously the notion of living into principles. And this becomes a very interesting expectation for them as leaders. As we begin to move then into our ethical perspectives, our identities, we notice that each lens prioritizes these core values differently. And each of them then has values that flow from them. As we think about these four perspectives, one of the core communication techniques in management is the notion that you interact with someone out of their core values. So that if I know that you live in the responsibilities lens and I live in the results lens, I'm going to ask you and mirror your principles as opposed to starting with what are your goals. If I know you're in the relationship lens, I'm going to start with what do you think is fundamentally fair? How do we believe we're going to get to strong community? Now, decision making is easier because you can get a better decision at the end of the day. It's more challenging because we actually have to listen and talk with each other. We have to respect their positions and we have to be open and flexible in order to adjust our beliefs and behaviors to those other perspectives. We then have to figure out together what are we going to do in order to be ethical. As we listen to each other, the language and the key words help us understand what lens people come from and what their value priorities. As we saw early on with the example from Ernst Young, some behavior can be justified using the values of different lenses. And so we may agree on behaviors even though we disagree about the reason for that behavior. These different definitions impact teamwork because we have different expectations for what counts for behaviors. My COO, Janine, and I had a really interesting conversation a couple of years ago now where we talked about what do we think it means to be a partner? What does it mean to be working together? And my definition was you check in a lot, often with each other, you change and you navigate based on the circumstances. And her definition, that's the results lens definition, by the way, her definition out of the relationship lens is you meet periodically and put in place what you're going to do, and then you just sort of go off and do it. And you don't worry about checking in on an ongoing basis. And we realized we both were unhappy because we had our own definitions of what behavior counted for being a good team member and had never checked with each other to notice the differences. And then we adjusted. I asked for more frequent check-ins. She asked that she be just left alone to make sure she got her work done. And we adjusted to include both sets of behaviors. And that's how you begin to resolve differences. What behaviors count for you for these core values? And then how can we make our circle of understanding expand to cover these various differences? Then we begin to move into what we call ethical maturity. How do we begin to commit to a path of growth? Over the next years of your lifetime, you will decide over and over again how to live into your best self. As you move from an identity as student to an employee, as you move perhaps from being a single person to being in a relationship, as you move into finding activities in various social groups and professional groups, in each of those changed contexts, you will have to determine how to live into your best self. As you create this reality, do it thoughtfully. I can interact with people from a place of they are just being mean and hateful and don't want me to succeed. Or I can interact with people from the belief that they are really doing the very best they know, and I can learn something from them as I hear how they're interacting and interpreting reality differently. You and I each determine the meaning of what happens to us. We may not be able to control what happens to us, but we can decide, what does this mean for me as a human being? One of the people that I admire is Nelson Mandela, and he was able to spend decades in prison for his beliefs and finally at some point came out. And one of the stories that he tells is that after he was out of prison and was in a leadership position in South Africa, he was out to lunch with friends. And he invited somebody at a neighboring table to come and join them. And the story goes that this person who joined them was very nervous and very agitated, but knew that he couldn't turn down the president of South Africa for lunch. After lunch, the lunch companion said, "Why was that guy so upset?" And Mandela said, "He was a prison guard at the prison that I was at. And every morning he did some act of disrespect to me as a human being that was deeply degrading. He was afraid that I was going to do the same thing to him that he did to me. And I chose instead to operate out of forgiveness and kindness." Out of that act, Mandela was able to transform the meaning of his prison stay into something that was gracious and open as opposed to spiteful and mean. I often wonder if I would have the same kind of graciousness, but that's how we determine the meaning of what happens to us. Each of us decide in our decisions how our history is going to unfold. And so we become an active participant in our lives as opposed to sitting back and letting our life happen to us. Brian Henning gives us some hope and some understanding about how to do this best. Embrace fallibility. Now, this one for me was huge because I was raised to say that all truth is absolute, and my job is to find truth absolutely. And if I change my ideas and my opinions, then somehow I am wrong and flawed as a human being. So what I've learned to do is to say, if I believe that that idea is true, if that way of looking at the world might be true, how would it change who I am? And how would I change what I do? And so I hold these ideas provisionally while I try them on in my imagination. Henning also says that we need to be able to live with intensity to create the greatest opportunity to thrive. Now, as I live my life, I know that there are times when I'm working with people who think about the world completely differently than I do. How do I live in that tension, staying open to the possibility so that it can resolve into something that we may not have even imagined together? And the way we do this is through moral imagination. What would be a good way to live together? What would be the ways that we could harmonize these different beliefs? How can I improvise, grow as I conceive of things that did not exist before? You and I are facing some really interesting problems. Just this week, we had 2 banks failed, another's being rescued. How do we improvise and grow in the face of financial uncertainty? I live in the West and I'm planning a road trip to California, and Tahoe is still under so much snow that the ski lifts are buried. How do I improvise in the face of perhaps a completely different climate expectation? In business, you are going to face things that you had no idea you were going to face. And you're going to be asked to do and take action that also lives into your core values, the core value of the organization, the values of the profession, and the values of the community that you live in. Your moral imagination is going to be a gift that will help you move into leadership roles to live into unrealized possibilities. We do this by continually paying attention. What do I really want? What is it that I'm striving for? What do I believe is going on in this situation? How am I using my power? Yesterday, I saw an ad for a webinar put on by HR professionals saying, are you being a bully? Are you using, or actually the words they said is, are you as a leader being the great Hulk and think that you know how to rescue everybody instead of letting them just do what they know how to do? Am I being a good example? You'll notice these are questions. A hallmark of what we teach in the Bear Decision Model, which was part of what you did in Merger Madness, is that ethics is about asking the right questions, not memorizing the right answers. These four questions can be taken with you into every situation. What do you want? What do you believe? How are you using your power? Are you being a good example? And that will help you engage your moral imagination in these new situations. But there's one more place I want to talk about, and that's our ethical blind spots. Each of us has, as we begin to think about where we want to move ahead, we also have places of fear, of anger, and places where we are not aware. Well, blind spots are places that we have habits of being that, in fact, get in the way of us being our best and highest ethical self. So earlier I talked about a habit of being I had that was anger. And I had, fortunately, some really good friends who said, Catherine, have you noticed that every time someone says something to you that you don't agree with, the first place you go into is defensiveness to give yourself time to think? I had not noticed that and was so very thankful for a conversation partner who was willing to bring that to my attention. Temptations are faced under stress. As you wind up, for example, the bank in Silicon Valley that noticed that it was having a run and it was about to not have enough liquidity, how do you as a leader respond to that stress? When you have a temptation at your accounting firm that everybody's cheating, and if you don't, you may not pass, how do you respond to that stress? And that's where character, who we are at our core, is so important. Vices emerge as we choose to act unethically. Most of us in this conversation do not choose to act unethically, but we need to be aware of that as well. So, as we begin to think about moral failure, this shadow side of the drive to acquire has two faces. First, you have people who refuse to care for themselves. Somebody else is responsible, they're going to take care of me, and I'm just here for the ride. The other side is we have people who are driven by envy and greed who never have enough and who will stomp over anybody to get what they want. And it results in huge imbalances of goods in our community. On the knowing side, we have people say, I don't want to learn. I don't want to learn anything new. What I know is good enough. I'm not going to challenge myself with new ideas, with new information. I'm just going to be. On the flip side, the overuse of this moral failure is what I know is right. I am the only one who knows, and I am an ideologue, and I expect you to believe just like I do, or I'm going to consider you nothing. Moving forward, this one is really interesting. We have people who, in positions of leadership, delegitimize the moral community. Now, this one's really subtle. So, in an organization, you have people who are called compliance officers. And then you have people in leadership who say, the compliance officers really aren't that big of a deal. We can figure out how to get on the edge and we can figure out how to make sure that they don't do what they say they're going to do. We have people in HR who are committed to equity. I bet we could game the system, and they really don't care anyway. And out of that, the people within the organization, the people within the community who are there to be our ethical conscience are seen as being not contributors to the well-being of the community. And thereby, we don't trust any of them. The other place and therefore, when that happens, there are no guards on people holding each other accountable to live into the best of who they know we are as individuals and organizations. The other strategy is to be dictatorial. My way or the highway. This is what we're going to do. We're not going to listen to anybody else. And then, as you know, when that happens, people go underground and find ways to sabotage the system. The final one is bonding. We have people who refuse to bond. They're not going to be part of a group. I must confess, I'm often part of this. I am a fierce individualist, and I hate going to these where everybody's going to wear the same T-shirt and we're going to go bowling. And I have learned that I have to be sure that I am part of a group and we bond together. We then have people who over-identify with the tribe and see nothing individual, and they go along with the tribe no matter what the tribe says and no matter what the tribe does in order to not be kicked out of community. I invite each of you to think about something that I learned when I was a relatively young attorney, and it's called your exit card. Each of you have to decide as you look at these areas of moral failure, what is it you will not do? What the teachers told me, or the seasoned attorney, was unless you think of that ahead of time, when the situation comes, you will slide into unethical behavior. So if what you say is, I will never cheat, no matter what, and the opportunity comes, are you willing to be fired if that happens and or find another job? If you say, I will never falsify financial documents to the best of my ability and knowledge, if asked to do so, do you have a strategy in place or are you willing to leave? Unless you think within your profession what you will not do, you do not have those moral boundaries about when you will stay or when you will leave. By the way, that list changes as you grow, so it's an ongoing conversation. What is my exit card? What is it that in this job, in this community, I will not do? And so as we begin to look at the sources of moral failure, if we fail to hold individuals accountable, either ourselves or our own self or each other, we can begin to pay attention to how do these drives for greed show up? How do the drives for not taking care of myself show up? And then what behaviors am I going to expect from individuals, regardless of whether anybody else is holding them accountable? What do I believe? What are the core norms and values of myself and this organization? What behaviors do I expect, and how do I communicate those to others? How do we harmonize our values through our regulations, through the policies we have in place? How do we know what policies we're going to follow, and how do we let people know what they are? How do we know what practices to enforce and when people are going to have a little bit of leeway? And then, are we a moral influencer? Who has the power to change the norms? How can we support ethical growth? And what my claim is that each one of us in this conversation has the power to change norms ever so slightly by what we will and will not do as we are members of a community. Each of us can use the gift of persuasion. We can engage in conversations to help others determine and follow appropriate behaviors. Each of us has power. Sometimes it's tiny, sometimes it's larger, but we can use our personal and organizational power because of our roles to shape policies. And then we can make decisions about allocating resources to support building a healthy culture. And even as an entry-level employee in your brand new job, you can use your gift of your time in how you allocate money and resources. And so as we come to the end, I want you to remember and to think about the fact that your identity, your values, your choices inform your ethical self. So, as we come together as a conclusion, I hope that something in this conversation resonated with you. I hope that something in this conversation found meaning and purpose and helped you understand why it is that you're doing the ethical exercises, why you did the ethical lens inventory, and helped you become a little more aware, more ethically agile, and set you on your path to ethical maturity. Thank you for taking this time with me. I look forward to continuing the conversation. Goodbye.